Focus on the Family is a multi-million-dollar Christian organization. This is part 2 of our discussion around this unbelievable empire. Welcome back to the Reimagining Ourselves podcast, where we discuss healing and co-creating a better world. Recently, we've been spending some time focusing on religious manipulation, how to spot it, how it is shaping parts of our culture, and my suggestions for a more loving expression of faith and spirituality. Last episode, we introduced James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family. I gave you my speculation on how Dobson's childhood experiences may have impacted him, and we discussed his problematic parenting advice. In this episode, we are going to discuss Dr. Dobson's attitudes about sex and women, from purity culture to domestic violence. I am a licensed therapist, and sex and intimacy support is one of the primary services that I provide. My sex and intimacy clients are typically in committed long-term relationships. I either see them individually or as a couple, and I help them to remove barriers and identify solutions so they can have healthy and satisfying sex lives. I am married. I've been with my husband, Garrett, since I was 18 years old. And as I discussed in my last video, there are a lot of things about my life that do align with a very traditional and religious marriage. However, I wholeheartedly believe that the only sex that is amoral is sex that is non-consensual, manipulative, coercive, or disrespectful to the human being outside of the bedroom. Basically, sex and sexual adjacent behaviors that actively cause harm. I am not going to deny that there are gifts and benefits to having sex with the same partner over and over, and we'll unpack those things further in future episodes on this channel as I continue to talk about relationships. But like with most things, there are different gifts and costs that come with both options. I feel that I have chosen the gifts that come with having one partner, but that means that I miss out on some things. And there are gifts and benefits that come with exploring your sexuality with multiple partners as well. And whichever path you choose does not determine your worth as a person. And therein lies the issue for me around the purity movement. Purity culture has really done a number on so many people, and we're going to get into the damage that it has caused. But first, let me explain what this movement is and what it has to do with James Dobson. The purity movement exploded in the 1990s out of conservative Christian groups across the Midwest. James Dobson is known as one of the founders of this movement. He urged young people to consider their future partners and avoid premarital sex, and directly equated sexual quote-unquote purity with worth. This purity movement included abstinence-only education, wild fear-mongering, purity balls, purity rings, and disturbing father-daughter covenants. The message, cloaked in coercive and shameful language, was that premarital sex would destroy your body, soul, relationships, and future. Many teens were taught that even thoughts of a sexual nature would lead to impurity before God. I went ahead and listened to Dobson's podcast episodes on family talk. We're gonna get into a little bit more about what family talk is in comparison to Focus on the Family in a future episode. But this podcast episode was called Why Purity Matters, and it helped me to get a better idea of Dobson's views on the matter. It actually made me laugh because James Dobson starts out with these wild claims about sexually transmitted diseases, and I was forcibly reminded of Coach Carr from Mean Girls. James Dobson and his son, Ryan Dobson, add their own commentary throughout these episodes about sexual immorality and promiscuity. They have such a visceral disdain for the quote-unquote sexually immoral that to me it really feels like it's motivated by something other than religious conviction. Then they play a speech from someone named Joe White about sexual purity. Now, I'm not familiar with Joe White, and I decided to avoid falling down another rabbit hole right now about him. But he has a lot of weird moments in this speech that I feel like are pretty revealing about his own underlying doctrine. Anyway, let's talk about some of the detrimental effects that this movement has had. This movement is associated with poor sexual and reproductive education, intense shaming of sexual feelings, and the lack of awareness around unhealthy relationships. Young girls were particularly taught throughout the 90s messages like, "It is your job to protect your purity and keep boys from stumbling." We see this theme throughout, leadership like Dobson's, where there's this absurd belief that women and girls do not experience sexual arousal, and men and boys are these sexual beasts that cannot contain their urges. I don't know what makes this myth persist, despite so much evidence to the contrary, but it's certainly perpetuated by men like Dobson. So you can hear how this disproportionately affects girls, even though it does have a really negative effect on boys too, that I'll get into in a minute. But I'm just going to talk about girls first. A 2014 review found that the purity movement seems to be connected to the sexual double standard because things like purity rings, purity balls, and overprotective parenting are seen disproportionately among young women and not as commonly among young men. This movement contributes to a culture that places inordinate responsibility on girls and teaches them that their bodies are particularly shameful and sinful and will lead boys into temptation if they are not careful. This is such a dangerous message to be giving young girls, many of whom make the connection that they are therefore to blame if they are sexually assaulted. Which brings me to another glaring problem with purity culture and the whole concept of virginity. I'm about to talk about CSA, so if that is not something you can listen to right now, I will have timestamps below so that you can skip ahead. So if that is not something you want to listen to right now, I'll have timestamps below so you can skip ahead. But CSA, or child sexual abuse or assault, is rampant in these same communities. Teaching young girls that they are responsible for preventing sexual impurity contributes to a culture where boys and men take little accountability for their actions, are held to very low standards, and girls and women who believe that their abuse has damaged them and are so filled with misplaced shame that they can barely make a sound. And many of these are closed communities that believe in keeping problems within the community. In addition to that, these kids who have been through sexual trauma are getting the message that this applies to them. And I'm going to give you 3 examples to drive this point home. The first example comes from me. If it comes up in conversation that my husband is the only man I've had sex with, like in the last video I posted where I was talking about the things I have in common with trad wives, I almost always feel the need to add the disclaimer, I mean, like consensual sex. I'm really trying to break that habit because you can imagine how it's like a record scratch. But it's because I don't know if I counted as a virgin when I met my husband if I had been raped as a child. And that is such a fucked up thing to burden a child sexual assault victim with, which is why the idea of virginity just being a social construct melts my heart. And it's not just me being sensitive, I've heard this other places too. When I worked in residential, one of my favorite residents expressed a similar feeling. The teen girls I worked with began talking about virginity and whether or not it was important. And this girl said, "Well, I'm not a virgin." When my coworker said, "What do you mean?" she said, "Haven't you read my file?" This sweet girl was abused and exploited while she was a small child, and she confidently and matter-of-factly stated that if virginity was a thing, hers was taken from her long ago. Journalist and writer Brianna Bell captured this perfectly. She writes, "I was 12 the first time I heard the metaphor. A rose, a cup, a piece of gum. It doesn't matter which one. All I knew was that I was used up. Trash. Nothing worth keeping or loving or protecting. I wanted desperately to be loved, kept, protected. I didn't have anyone to tell my secrets to. Every time I tried, a hand clamped over my mouth. So I stayed quiet, my stomach roiling in pain and fear. Who will save me? A chewed up piece of gum." The silence was deafening, and so I found solace and rescue in the only one who knew who I was. Him and him and him. This piece really resonated with me. I think it highlights the way that not only are girls getting hurt in these communities, but then they receive these messages over and over that reinforce the idea that this abuse makes them less valuable. The dynamic between the fathers and their daughters is also disturbing to me. Fathers are encouraged to be vigilant about their daughter's purity, and many fathers throughout the 90s and early 2000s presented their daughters with purity rings. Daughters took pledges that they would guard their bodies and hearts until marriage. Fathers took pledges that they would assume control over their daughter's sexuality, often with the implication that they really understood the way that boys wanted to defile their daughters. Purity balls were attended by fathers and daughters, and fathers took an oath to cover their daughters as their authority to prevent sexual impurity. I think boys and men have experienced a lot of harm from the purity movement as well. Young boys are taught some really negative things about themselves, and I've heard stories from people who were terrified to masturbate, but they were monsters as soon as they started having any sexual thoughts. And boys are left very confused. And it obviously hurts boys too to not be taught what healthy and intimate sexual relationships look like. Purity culture became linked with abstinence-only sexual education. This movement, like so many others in the conservative Christian space, popped up during the 70s and honestly seemed to be shameless by the 90s as far as their involvement with political movements. In 1981, the Adolescent Family Life Act, nicknamed the Chastity Act, passed. This act allowed the government to fund abstinence-only advocacy programs for the first time in U.S. history, and more recently, a program called the Title V Sexual Risk Avoidance Education, SRAE, has continued to provide funding for abstinence-only sexual education. And altogether, we're talking about over $2 billion federal dollars that were spent on abstinence-only sexual education. And what a waste of federal money, because abstinence-only sexual education does not work. 88% of purity pledgers engaged in premarital intercourse, and their rates of STD transmission did not differ from that of non-pledgers. Receiving abstinence-only sexual education is correlated with higher teen pregnancy rates, more frequent instances of sexually transmitted diseases, infections among young people, young people's engagement in sexual activity with a greater number of partners, and even a reduced average age of engagement in vaginal intercourse. And all of that is cited below. So all this really does is cause harm. What young Christian girls are taught about their bodies is horribly inaccurate. These different myths about virginity and the hymen and what sex is like are all disturbing and damaging. In these abstinence-only circles, girls are taught that they have greater control over their sexual desires, and that boys will want sex ravenously and will struggle to control themselves. When there is no appropriate sexual education, these kids are naturally turning to each other, pornography, and other ill-advised sources of information. Girls are taught that sex will hurt them, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as nobody talks about sex, so the boys don't even understand that there are ways of doing it that are really enjoyable for both partners. And so you can see how that vicious cycle happens where people believe that it's going to be terrible and hurt. So then when they do give in to their natural desires for sexual intimacy, there is so much room for damage and abuse. These girls or young women are dissociating from painful sex because that's what they've been taught to expect. There's also a problem of sexual dysfunction within many marriages connected to purity culture and abstinence, because it is really hard for most people to go from believing that sex is evil, unholy, and impure, will damage them and send them to hell, to suddenly enthusiastically engaging in a satisfying and fulfilling sex life on their wedding night. The personal accounts I've heard of people who struggle to believe that sex is acceptable, even within the context of their marriages, is staggering, and it makes perfect sense. Despite the little caveat that sex turns good as soon as the marriage papers are signed, many Christians internalize the negative messaging that they've heard for years and years about sex, and have a very hard time undoing all of those, mental networks that they've built over time. Alright, so that is, the purity movement, the abstinence-only movement that Focus on the Family promotes. But speaking of marriage, let's switch gears just a little and discuss Dobson's terrible advice on marriages. So here we're going to discuss domestic abuse, and again, I'll have timestamps if you want to skip this part at all. Now, you guys know I've begun a series of stories about people's experiences in high-control religious communities. And one woman wrote to me to tell me about how Dobson's book, Love Must Be Tough, encouraged her to stay in an abusive relationship for 6 years. And so I have to express my gratitude that she brought this to my attention because it encouraged me to look into his teachings on the matter, and they're so dark. And I hope that I can shed a little light on what's wrong with these teachings. This book, Love Must Be Tough, is basically all about how to keep problems in the relationship and involving as few other people as possible to keep the relationship at all costs. You guys know I love relationships. I love relationships. I love when a relationship can be saved. But Dobson and I are nowhere near on the same page about this because listen to this. His book specifically says that it is for any partner in a relationship that is looking to save the relationship, and that this advice is offered to, quote, the wife whose husband is an alcoholic or drug abuser or child molester. His advice, which never includes going to the police. So let's take a closer look. In chapter 13 of this book, he responds to a desperate woman who wrote in requesting guidance. She reported that her teeth had been loosened recently because of how viciously her husband had been beating her. First, Dobson says, our purpose should be to change the husband's behavior, not to kill the marriage. His advice, force the matter into a crisis by intentionally agitating the abusive husband. His promise is that the subsequent display of violence will shock the husband into acknowledging that he has a severe problem, so that he will agree to Christian counseling. If that's not sick enough, if it doesn't show, a man who is so out of touch with the fact that women in domestic violence relationships are killed so frequently, this next part gets even worse. He then adds the following. I have seen marital relationships where the woman deliberately baited her husband until he hit her. This is not true in most cases of domestic violence, but it does occur. Why, one may ask, would any woman want to be hit? Because females are just as capable of hatred and anger as males, and a woman can devastate a man by enticing him to strike her. It is a potent weapon. Once he has lost control and lashed out at his tormentor, she then sports undeniable evidence of his cruelty. She can show her wounds to her friends who gasp at the viciousness of that man. She can press charges against him in some cases and have him thrown in jail. She can embarrass him at his work or in the church. In short, by taking a beating, she instantly achieves a moral advantage in the eyes of neighbors, friends, and the law. It may even help her justify a divorce, or if one comes, to gain custody of her children. Remember what the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor did to American morale and unity? It solidified our forces and gave us a cause worth fighting for. There are those who believe President Roosevelt ignored warnings of the Pearl Harbor invasion for the precise purpose of unifying our resolve against a rising Japanese imperialism. In the same spirit, I have seen women belittle and berate their husbands until they set aflame with rage. Some wives are more verbal than their husbands and can win a war of words any day of the week. Finally, the men reach a point of such frustration that they explode, doing precisely what their wives were begging them to do in the first place. I remember one woman who came to church with a huge black eye contributed by her husband. She walked to the front of the auditorium before a crowd of 500 people and made a routine announcement about an upcoming event. Everyone in attendance was thinking about her eye and the cad who did this to her. That was precisely what she wanted. I happened to know that her non-communicative husband had been verbally antagonized by his wife until he finally gave her the prize she sought. Then she brought it to church to show it off. It does happen. Ugh. If that was upsetting to you, let's just take a breath together. I'm sure I don't have to explain to you why this perspective is so chilling. Why this passage, which reveals a sinister belief that the woman must have had it coming, sickened me to my core to read. So upsetting to me to hear Dobson act like punching your wife in the face is a natural reaction to anything, and it really makes me wonder what his wife has endured. In A Well-Trained Wife, Tia Lovings describes the way that she sought help and maybe escape from a Baptist Christian counselor. She described the abuse she was facing in a letter which included horrific, impulsive physical displays as well as ritualistic quote-unquote discipline. The counselor reported that he sees this kind of thing all the time, and his understanding of the problem: women were not doing enough to honor their husbands. What are women in these communities supposed to do when they're taught that their abuse is likely a result of their own moral failings, when they're taught that leaving these relationships is not an option? And people like Dobson are encouraging Christian communities to look at abused women with skepticism. These men are part of a system that Tia and her children were almost killed in October of 2007. This rhetoric is dangerous and deadly. It destroys families and communities by not permitting women to leave abuse, normalizing violence, and ultimately paving the way for lethal results. Women are taught that there is no reason to leave their abusive relationships, and they're subsequently trapped as their lives, their vibrancy, and their God-given gifts are drained from them. It'll come as no surprise that Dobson is a vocal anti-feminist. Dobson claims that feminism is a key force behind the destruction of family values. He makes many claims about it being in contradiction to a biblical and holy life. I find this claim worth investigating, and luckily someone else already did that. A journal article by Sally Gallagher, Controlled for the Religious Underpinnings of Anti-Feminist Beliefs. She found that reading the Bible, believing the Bible word for word, and believing that the Bible is the most important source of direction for our lives, all of these things had zero statistical effect on attitudes towards feminism. But guess what did have that statistical effect? Regardless of religious affiliation, and even among non-believers, the amount of hours spent consuming Christian evangelical radio or television programs was a strong indicator for hostility towards feminism. So I find this to be particularly compelling because it highlights the direct damage these talk show programs have had on women's rights. And as we've been discussing, these high control groups are, in my opinion, acting with evil and selfish desires for power and control. They implement these rigid hierarchies that allow for all manner of abuses. James Dobson is an important figure in these communities and a champion for Christian nationalism. And another, perhaps more extreme example I've come across is Bill Gothard and the IBLP way of life, which I think we will discuss in a future episode. So make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell if this topic interests you. Hopefully, in today's episode, I've explained why Dobson's attitudes about sex and towards women are so incredibly disturbing to me. I think that they're very damaging to healthy, happy, and thriving families. They contribute to a culture that traps women in horrific situations. Next episode, we're going to be discussing focus on the family's perspectives on race and the LGBT community. So stick around for that too. Thank you for listening, and I'll meet you here next time on Reimagining Ourselves.